I never had a vision to climb Mount Everest. As with everything else, it just more or less grew. You know, I started in the New Zealand Alps, and I got more competent, and I climbed harder mountains there, and I made a number of first ascents. And I had a year in the European Alps and climbed there. And then we decided we'd like to go off to the Himalayas, not Everest. We went off to the Indian Goal Himalaya, and we were pretty successful. We climbed half a dozen new peaks of well over 20,000 feet. And it really wasn't until then that we read in the paper that the British had got permission to do a reconnaissance to the south side of Mount Everest through Nepal, which up until those days had been completely closed to foreigners. That the idea that, gee, it'd be fun to go along on that reconnaissance certainly entered my mind. And we contacted the organisers in London, and two of us were invited from that expedition to join up with the party and go into the south side of Mount Everest. And, you know, it's almost like a football team, even a team of climbers. If you're pretty competent, and if you don't make any grave errors, once you're in, you're in. I mean, you're sort of appointed next time. So on the Everest reconnaissance, we had a successful expedition. We came back next year, and we had some more successful climbs. And then in '53, we were invited to join the summit attempt. So in a way, it was a growing process and a learning process. And never in my early days did I ever think of attempting to reach the summit of Mount Everest. I never climbed up anything one step at a time. You know, you read so much about at extreme altitudes, how you take one step and then you stop and pant and puff for a while and then take one more step. I don't ever remember doing that. I mean, you're much slower at high altitude because of the lack of oxygen. But I used to keep moving pretty steadily most of the time. And I didn't have to stop too often for panting and puffing. I think I was pretty well adapted and acclimatized to altitude. And I think I was very fit in those days, so could keep moving very freely. Well, there were lots of challenges. You know, even the route we were climbing Mount Everest was one of the two easiest routes on the mountain, as we know now. Of course, nobody had climbed it then. And but even so, there are demanding parts of it. At the bottom of the mountain, there was the ice fall, where it's a great tumbled ruin of ice that's all pouring down and filled with crevasses and ice walls. It's under slow but constant movement. So it's a dangerous place because things are always tumbling down. So you have to establish a route up through that, which you can get with reasonable safety. But over the years, literally dozens of people have died in the crevasse. They've been engulfed by ice walls falling down and things of that nature. I had one experience on the ice fall with Tenzing. We were actually descending after having been further up the mountain. And it was getting close towards dark, so we wanted to get through the ice fall before darkness fell. And we were roped together, but I was rushing down ahead in the lead. And about halfway down, there was a narrow crevasse. I guess it was about 4 feet wide, but just a bit too wide to step across. But on the lower lip was a great chunk of ice stuck against the ice wall. And we'd used that as sort of a stepping stone to get over the gap. Well, I came rushing down the hill, and without thinking too carefully, I just leapt in the air and landed on the chunk of ice, whereupon the chunk of ice broke off and dropped into the crevasse with me on top of it. And it was interesting how everything seemed to start going slowly, even though I was free falling into the crevasse. My mind obviously was working very quickly indeed. And the great chunk of ice started tipping over. And I realized if I wasn't careful, I'd be crushed between the ice and the wall of the crevasse. So I just sort of bent my knees and leapt in the air. But I was still falling, but now I was a couple of feet clear of the chunk of ice. Well, you know, time really seemed to pass, even though I was falling clear. And I realized that unless the rope came tight fairly soon, you know, I would come to a rather sticky end on the bottom of the crevasse. And up top, Tenzing had acted very quickly. He thrust his ice axe into the snow, whipped the rope around it, and the rope came tight with a twang, and I was stopped and swung in against the ice wall. And the great chunk of ice just carried on and smashed to smithereens at the bottom of the crevasse. Well, then really it was just what I would have called a routine mountaineering matter. I had my ice axe and I had my crampons on my feet, so I chipped steps on the side. I was able to bridge the crevasse, and I worked my way up to the top and got safely out. Now, I wouldn't have said at any stage, because it all happened so quickly, fear really didn't have much opportunity to emerge. My only idea was to get safely out of this unfortunate predicament. And of course, without Tenzing's very competent mountaineer's response, I certainly wouldn't have made it. But once he had stopped me, then I was able to, using the techniques of mountaineering, get myself safely to the top again. But those sort of things, you know, when you've been going as long as I have, many of them have happened during the course of your life. But you tend to forget them, really. It's the good moments I think nature tricks us a little bit, because you tend to remember the good moments rather than the uncomfortable ones. And so when you leave the mountain, you remember the great moments on the mountain, and as soon as you leave the mountain, you want to go back again. We reached the south summit of Everest, which is 28,700 feet, and then we looked along the summit ridge, which is quite an impressive narrow ridge. It's corniced on one side, which is overhanging with snow and ice, so you can't keep on the crest of the ridge. We had to keep down on the steep left-hand side on snow and ice. But halfway along the ridge there's a rock step. It's about 40 feet high. And I cut steps along the side of the ridge until we reached the bottom of the rock step. And looking up at the rock step at 29,000 feet, it really did look extremely difficult to overcome. But then I noticed that out to the right of the rock step, where the ice was plastered onto the wall, there was a crack, I don't know, maybe 2 feet wide, but just large enough to crawl inside, where the ice was breaking away from the rock. And I sort of crawled inside that, and then I wriggled and jammed my way up the crack with rock on one side and ice on the other, and finally pulled myself out onto the top of the rock step. And that was really the first moment during the whole of the expedition that I was confident that we were going to get to the top. But overcoming that rock step, which we knew existed, we'd seen it from far below, made me feel the confidence that we were going to succeed. And sure enough, on we went, and we ultimately reached the top. Funnily enough, that step is now called the Hillary Step. And any climber who climbs Everest from that south side at some stage has to go up the Hillary Step. Or I would put it in quite a different fashion and say never at any stage until we actually got up the rock step was I confident that we were going to be successful. My feeling was that we would give it everything we had, but we had no surety that we were going to reach the top. In fact, I believe that if someone starts out on a challenging activity, completely confident that they're going to succeed, why bother starting? I mean, it's not much of a challenge. I think it's much better to start out on something that you're not at all sure that you can get up. And then if you do overcome it and you do manage to defeat the obstacles, then the satisfaction is so much greater. My mind concentrates pretty much and rather firmly on the job in hand. Certainly on Everest, for instance, where we were using oxygen, and I was constantly doing mental arithmetic, checking the pressure of the oxygen bottles, and I had to convert that pressure over to the number of litres of oxygen that remained in the bottle, and then work out how many hours or minutes of activity we still had left. So constantly we were dealing with the problems of the slopes and the soft snow and everything else and crevasses that we had to deal with. But at the same time, I constantly ticking over in my mind was this mental arithmetic about the usage of our oxygen and how much time we had to get there and get down again. I think a lot of the modern mountaineers, with their very good technical equipment and their very accomplished techniques, can climb perhaps more naturally and easily than we did in our day. But of course we had one problem that the modern mountaineer doesn't have, and that is this psychological barrier. We really didn't know whether it was humanly possible to reach the top of Mount Everest. And even using oxygen, as we were, if we did get to the top, we weren't at all sure whether we wouldn't drop dead or something of that nature. All the physiologists had warned us that the altitude of the summit of Everest was a very marginal altitude and might be extremely dangerous. So one had this feeling in your mind all the time that maybe you were just pushing things a bit beyond what humans were meant to do, and you couldn't ignore that feeling. But because of strong motivation, you keep plugging on, and you seem to be going okay, and nothing seems to be going wrong, so you persist. And we persisted, of course, and ultimately set foot on the summit. It was more a feeling of quiet satisfaction, I'd have said, and almost a little bit of surprise. You know, so many really tough expeditions had tried the mountain before and not been successful. And here Tenzing and I were standing on the summit. You know, it almost seemed remarkable that we were there where others had failed before. I think I kept my more exciting moments for when we finally got down to the bottom of the mountain again. And all the dangers were behind us, we were safely off the mountain. And then we did have a little radio at base camp, and someone tuned in to the BBC in London. And the BBC announcer was just describing the coronation of Queen Elizabeth II. And then he broke into the coronation and said, we have great pleasure in announcing that the British Everest expedition has finally reached the summit of Mount Everest. And then almost for the first time, I felt, my God, we've climbed the thing, you know, we've had authoritative support from the BBC in London, we've done it. And I think at that moment, the excitement of it came into my mind. Whereas before, it'd been satisfaction, and but we still had the problem of getting safely off the mountain again, and we were very much aware of this too. On lower mountains in alpine areas, I certainly have had a great sense of excitement and achievement at reaching the top of a difficult peak. But I think certainly on Everest, where due to the lack of oxygen, life is a somewhat lower level, as it were, I certainly did not have that tremendous feeling, not wanting to jump around with joy or anything of that nature. I was just very happy to be there and felt very satisfied that we'd finally succeeded in getting there. Well, I think I'd try and find out what are the things that made them excited, because all adventure, doesn't matter what field you're in. You can be in education or science or business. Almost anything has its moments in which you have to overcome considerable challenges. And if you're able to overcome those challenges, you get a great sense of satisfaction. And I would say a businessman who's been able to achieve a successful deal of some sort would probably feel very similar sort of reaction to someone who just managed to get on top of a mountain. You've overcome problems. You may not have been frightened to death, but you've overcome problems and difficulties, and you've achieved success, and you certainly feel pretty happy about it. I think the element of danger, which is present in things like mountaineering and sailing around the world and all those type of things, does add a tremendous amount to the challenge. There's simply no question that if you're doing something that has the possibility that you may make a mistake or something may go wrong and you'll come to a rather sticky end, this, I think, does add something really to the whole challenge. You really feel you're doing something exciting and perhaps a little desperate, and if you're successful, it certainly gives you that little bit more satisfaction. When I was very young, I read about it, dreamed about it, and when the opportunity came to do something about it, I seemed to slip into it, perhaps rather easily. And certainly even the companionship that I made with similar friends in adventurous activities, I found very, very rewarding. There's nothing is better fun than sitting down with a group of your peers who've done similar sort of things and just talking about your experiences, maybe boasting a little bit here and there too, and but sharing experiences that you all appreciate, you all know have been frightening and dangerous, and have been successful. And this was a very, very good and happy experience you can have with a group of your friends, just chatting about things like that. In the early days, when I liked to be the bomb, as it were, of the expedition and rush on ahead and do things faster than anybody else, those days very pleasantly actually merged into periods when I organised and inspired expeditions and selected these younger people who were then the bombs of the operation. And then once again it drifted into this involvement with the people of the area, still loving the mountains, but finding the people just as important too. And on it's gone. As I get older and less physically capable, I find other challenges sort of have grown up and certainly become just as important to me. The only way one can encourage them to find their own path is to tell them that, in my view, that's the only way in life. That's one of the things I really like about Tibetan Buddhism. I have really no particular religious beliefs or followings at all, but I am interested in all religions. And in Tibetan Buddhism, one of the strongest features is that they believe that everyone must choose their own path in life. They don't try to convert you to their particular form of religion, but it's up to you to choose your own path. And I like that very much indeed. I think that's a great approach to philosophy. I think that we have to learn to choose our own path, to make our own way, and in many ways to overcome our own problems. There are many people, for instance, who, when they're in a moment of danger, will, say, resort to prayer, and they hope that God will get them out of this trouble. I've always rather had the feeling that to do that is a slightly sneaky way of doing things. If I've got myself into that situation, I've always felt it's up to me to make the effort somehow to get myself out again, and not to rely on some superhuman being who can just lift me out of this rather miserable situation. Now, it may be a slightly arrogant approach, but I still feel that in the end it's up to us to meet our challenges and to overcome them. Coming down from Nupla Pass on one occasion in very difficult conditions through crevasse country, I stepped on a piece of snow which happened to be the thin bridge over a crevasse, and I shot through the thin bridge and started falling into the depths of the crevasse. Well, my thoughts, which were fairly quick at the time, were just how can I overcome this? So almost instinctively, because the crevasse was relatively narrow, I kicked my feet out towards one wall of the crevasse, and on my feet I had these spiked crampons. So I jammed my feet against the wall into the ice, and then my shoulder bridged the crevasse, and I stopped, and there I was halfway down the crevasse with feet against one wall and my shoulder against the other. And I held onto my ice axe, which after all any good mountaineer is told to do, and ultimately I was able to use my ice axe to chip steps in the ice and get safely out. So I've sort of moved from being a child who dreamed a lot and read a lot of books about adventure to actually getting involved in things like mountaineering, and then becoming a reasonably competent mountaineer and going off to the Himalayas, doing a lot of climbing and going off on expeditions to the Antarctic, and that sort of active adventurous stage. And then I more or less, as I got older, I moved into a period really where I was more involved in organising, raising funds and leading expeditions. So I was the, sort of the motivating factor in the expeditions, but perhaps less active. I wasn't the hotshot heading for the summit sort of thing. I had other members of the party who did it. And then I think as I got somewhat older again, I became increasingly interested in, particularly in the people of the Himalayas. And I built up very close friendships with them, and I became concerned about the things that they wanted, schooling and hospitals and things of that nature. And that's carried on for quite a while. But perhaps in more recent years, certainly in the last 15 years or so, I've also become very much involved in environmental matters. So I would say now that my major interests are involved in people and in the environment. All my dreams are almost all adventurous dreams. I used to, in my teens, go for, I suppose in many ways I was a fairly, not perhaps lonely, but I didn't really have many friends and so on. And I used to go on long walks. I was a very keen walker, and as I walked along the roads and tracks and everything around this countryside area, I'd be dreaming. My mind would be miles away, and I would be slashing villains with swords and capturing beautiful maidens and doing all sorts of sort of heroic things just purely in my dreams. And I used to love, I'd walk for hours and hours, and my mind would, be far away in all sorts of heroic efforts. I never really felt that this was going to take place in quite that way. I think I was reasonably practical in that sense. But I rather enjoyed this dreaming phase. And certainly I was also a very great reader. And the books I read were initially very largely on the sort of adventurous sort of activities. And the sort of Warlord of Mars or Georgette Heyer and those sort of romantic adventure type things. I used to, when I was going to high school, I lived right out in the country, but I went to a big school in the city. And I had to travel about 2 hours each day, each way to school, so I was on the train about 4 hours a day. And I used to get a book out of the library every day, and so I was reading a book a day for quite a number of years. And most of the books really had some sort of adventurous slant. So I guess these books tended to stimulated my sort of periods when I dreamt about doing all these things. I wasn't really doing anything at that stage, but I was certainly reading about it and dreaming about it. And I went with a school party about 250 miles south of Auckland, where I lived, down to our national park area where there are a number of big volcanic mountains, and there's lots of snow there, and this was the middle of winter. And there was snow everywhere. It was a really good heavy snow year. This was the first time I'd ever seen snow, because we don't get it in Auckland. And for 10 days I skied and scrambled around the hills. And for me it was the most wonderful experience I'd ever had up to that stage. And I think it really was the beginning of my enthusiasm for mountains and for snow and ice. In fact, it was really the first real adventure I'd had, whereas before I just read about it and talked about it. And I think as a consequence, it built up, even at that early stage, a very strong affection for mountaineering. I knew I could do it and enjoy it, and so, it grew on me, and of course after that I did a great deal more. I think when I came home I was quite good at relating to my families, telling them probably slightly exaggerated stories of my adventures, and certainly my brother and sister and my parents were pretty patient about it. They listened with interest. But I'm inclined to think, in looking back, that I actually told quite a good story, so that they found my discourses quite interesting. And I was doing things that they at the time weren't doing. And so I think I did impart this growing enthusiasm to them. I had a number of friends who were interested in tramping and trekking around our local hills. But as I got older, I discovered that I tended to be rather more energetic and stronger walkers than they were. And so I always seemed to be pushing young ladies up steep hills and clambering up trees to find out where we were, and I sort of quickly became pretty active in that sort of way. I still wasn't doing anything of great consequence, but I was loving the out of doors and loving forcing myself to travel quickly around the countryside and do very long treks, and I enjoyed it very much. I feel that my life really sort of developed as I went along. I was never one of those people who at an early age had picked an objective and worked steadily towards it. All I knew is that I wanted to get involved in adventurous activity. I didn't have any specific type of activity, but just I wanted to do things that were exciting and adventurous. And, I had a fairly diffused feeling as to precisely what it should be. I did have definitely one heroic figure who impressed me very much indeed. And that was the great Antarctic explorer, Shackleton. Shackleton I always admired because he was, Shackleton was a tough man and he was a very good leader. And whenever he was in difficult circumstances, which he frequently was, he seemed to have the great ability to inspire his men and lead his party safely out of those conditions. So certainly Shackleton, I would have said, more than anything, was a role model for me. And later on, when I was down in the Antarctic myself and doing various adventures, I really felt that I tried to behave perhaps a little bit more like Shackleton, like any of the other famous Antarctic explorers. Well, Shackleton was a man who was prepared to make a decision and change his mind quickly. There are, a lot of very successful explorers who choose their plan and their path and stick to it very closely indeed, following it very methodically through. This was not the attitude of Shackleton, and certainly wasn't my attitude. The main objective remained, but there were always a multitude of alternatives of how you achieve these objectives. So I was the sort of Antarctic explorer. If someone came up with a good idea, I was perfectly prepared to accept it. Now, a lot of people who are leading an expedition, if someone produces a good idea, they refuse to accept it because they feel that it's, letting themselves down. But I was happy to accept anybody's idea and to absorb it and take it over and use it. And usually they were pretty good ideas. And I was always prepared to, if the circumstances seemed suitable, prepared to change a complete plan, to go in a different direction or use a different method. In that sense, I think I admired Shackleton. He was very adaptable, and I tried to be very similar. I think it was a combination of feeling and judgment, really. I just happened to be that sort of person that I enjoy making out plans, but I also enjoy changing plans. And on an expedition, although I may start out with quite a detailed plan, I'm quite prepared to change it at any moment and completely redo it. And so I think our expeditions tended to be very adaptable ones. We achieved the final objectives just the same, perhaps, as many other expeditions, but maybe we had more fun in the process because if there seemed something we could vary and do that was interesting, well, we did it. And we still carried on to achieve our major objectives. We weren't expected to go into it. Really, my father's training, he was the editor of a country newspaper. So he was very much involved in press activities. And my mother was a school teacher. But my father took over a newspaper in a small country town. And it had the grand name of the Turkau District News. And it was very small. But he did everything, he was reporter. He went to all the football matches and reported on them. He knew everybody in the whole area. And then he would write the articles. He would set up the actual type, as you used to have to do in those days. And then we had a printing press in a shed on our small farm, and he'd print the newspaper. In fact, I think the only thing he didn't do was actually deliver it round to all the houses in the area. So he, in his own way, was, I think, a very resourceful individual. But my parents also were people of very strong character. They had strong principles, as many people did in those days, and it was during the early days of the Depression. I know my father felt very strongly indeed feelings that there was a period when food was being destroyed in order to keep the price of food up. And yet there were thousands, millions of people, going short on food. And that type of thing really irritated him. He thought that was completely unjust. So I was rather, although I was not aware of it at the time, I think I was brought up to this feeling that it was important to be interested in the welfare of other people and other people around the world, really. My mother always used to say to me a thing which really, when I look back on it, wasn't terribly logical. When I had a large meal put in front of me, and even I had a pretty hearty appetite, couldn't quite get through it, she would say, "Edmund, remember the starving millions in Asia." Now, what possible use my consuming it would do to the starving millions in Asia, I don't really know. But the fact remains that I was brought up to think about the starving millions in Asia. So that meant I had to clean my plate up and not leave anything and waste it. Later on, I got more involved with the starving millions in Asia, but perhaps in a slightly more practical way, in helping some of them with schooling and hospitaling and even in agriculture. I really wasn't aware of it at the time. I didn't analyze really what my parents were doing and say, that's a good thing, I must do that when I get older. Those sort of thoughts never entered my mind. But I was definitely brought up in an atmosphere where my parents had these firm convictions. Some of their attitudes were pretty firm ones. They had very strong ideas about what was right and wrong and all the rest of it. And I had great arguments with my father as a consequence. But I don't think there's any question at all that a great deal of their, what I would regard as very good sound philosophy, almost unconsciously was handed on to their children. Well, I don't think they really cared too much. I mean, in fact, I don't know that they were all that, hardly knew that it was going on. They knew that I used to love going on long walks, but I'm sure that they didn't really realize that when I was walking, I was dreaming in a different world and, really wasn't quite at home, as it were, when I was doing it. They were aware that I was a very keen reader, but then they thought that was a good thing anyway. And they certainly didn't supervise the type of books which I read. I would have said, my reading tended to be perhaps the lighter, more adventurous type of thing, rather than, I wasn't a great reader of Shakespeare and things of that nature, although I had to do it at school. But I think they pretty much left me alone in that respect. I knew I wasn't smarter than other kids. In fact, no, I had, when I first went to high school, I was really a relatively lonely child. I didn't really have any friendships there. I started off at high school a couple of years younger than the majority of the students, because at the little country school, primary school that I attended, my mother, who had been a school teacher, sort of coached me. And I became the child genius of the Turcotte Primary School, which I can assure you was not all that big a deal in those days. But for the small Turcotte primary school, I sort of skipped a few classes, and I finally went to high school when I was 11 instead of the normal days, the year of 13 years. And but coming from a country area, going into a big city school, the school which academically is probably the best school in New Zealand, it was quite a shock to me, really. I was younger and smaller than the other students, and I really had no friends there whatsoever. And for a year or two, it was quite difficult for me. It was a lonely existence, and I certainly didn't particularly enjoy it. As I started growing then, and I remember in one year I grew 6 inches, and the next year I grew 5 inches, and which is not uncommon with kids that sort of age. But suddenly I started getting bigger, and I was bigger than lots of my fellow students, and I became more, I guess, physically competent, and so I gained in confidence in that way. But I was always a very modest student. But I was sort of in the middle, I wasn't awful and I wasn't good, but I was adequate. I did find that I was getting increasingly physically active. I was never what you would call a great athlete, in the sense that a great athlete has a tremendous eye and tremendous ball sense, and great speed of movement and all that sort of thing. I was more the perhaps slightly rugged, robust sort of type. I was physically strong, I think, and but I was also pretty strongly motivated. And even I think in those early days, if I started out to do something, I generally ended up by getting pretty close to completing it. I think motivation is the single most important factor in any sort of success. Physical fitness is important, technical skill is important, pardon me, maybe even the desire for money is important in some respects. But sort of basic motivation, the desire to succeed, the desire to stretch yourself to the utmost, I think is the most important factor that certainly in the field of exploration and activity is the thing that makes the difference between someone who does really well and someone who doesn't. Well, I've always felt that it's far more important to set your sights high, aim for something high, and even fail on it if necessary. To me, that's always been more impressive than someone who doesn't ask for very much and achieves it. I mean, there's not a great deal of satisfaction in that, in my view. I've always tried to carry things through to a conclusion once I start on them, but I really feel that setting your sights high and making yourself extend what, in my case, certainly were modest abilities, to extend them to the utmost. If you succeed, you certainly get a tremendous sense of satisfaction. I have very modest abilities. Academically, I was very modest, mediocre, perhaps. And I think perhaps physically I didn't have a great athletic sense, but I was big and strong. But I think maybe the only thing in which I was less than modest was, I think, in motivation maybe. I really wanted very strongly to do many of these things. And once I started, I didn't give up all that easily. I was prepared to change, but I didn't give up. Well, it sounds arrogant really, but I can't really remember having all that many failures in major things that I set out to do. Sometimes perhaps objectives almost changed during the course of something you were attempting to do. you would decide that a more important objective was such and such a thing rather than what you'd initially set out to do. But I think on the whole, I have been able to carry through the majority of my projects to some sort of successful conclusion. Well, I still regard adventure pretty much as a hobby, to tell you the honest truth. And I think this approach to it is keeps one refreshed almost. I think if you just regard adventure as a business, well, it can become very boring, as many other businesses can become. But even though adventure changed my life considerably, both in what I was doing and even economically, I guess, I've always regarded myself in a sense as a competent amateur. And because of that, I think there's been a freshness has been brought to it, that every new adventure has been a new experience and great fun. I really like to enjoy my adventures. You know, I get frightened to death on many, many occasions. But of course, fear can be also a stimulating factor. And I think when you're afraid, you know, the blood surges in the veins and so on. If you get rigid with fear, quite obviously, fear is not a very satisfactory characteristic to have. But if it's a stimulating factor, then I think you can often extend yourself far more than you really believed was possible. And instead of being, you know, just a mediocre sort of person, for a moment anyway, you become someone of considerable competence. I know that in many ways I'm basically a very mediocre person. And I know I've been afraid on many occasions. But I also know that if your abilities are fairly modest, there are ways in which you can use them effectively. I think, for instance, that prior planning of what you're doing, slowly and carefully working out how you're going to meet problems if they arise, I think that can be enormously helpful. If an emergency arises, you've already thought out the type of thing that you can do, and the type of decisions you can make, the type of orders you can give, and so overcome that problem and get through. Now, I always have in my expeditions people who are academically far cleverer than I am, and even technically far more competent. So if you want to lead an expedition, in a sense you've got to keep ahead of them, these very bright, competent characters you have with you, who are marvellous to have on the expedition. And I've always found you can do that by each night when you go to bed, you just let your mind dwell on the likely things that may happen next day, and think out carefully the sort of decisions that may be necessary to make in order to have the program carried through. So next day, when something happens, you're the one who's thought about it, and you're the one that has the ideas, whereas all the brighter ones really haven't spent too much time thinking about it. They have to produce it quickly out of their minds. And sometimes their ideas, of course, are very good. But even for a mediocre person like me, if you've pre-planned it and thought it out, then you can give sound decisions at pretty short notice. I really think there are some people who are natural leaders, you know, have the ability to think quickly and well, choose the right decisions at the right moment. But I think there are an awful lot of us who have to learn how to be a leader. And in actual fact, I believe that most people, if they really want to, can become competent leaders. I think I was the prime example of someone with relatively modest abilities really, but I think I learned to become a reasonably competent leader. And even practice is, is quite a useful attribute in this respect. As you do more expeditions and more adventures, you get more experience, and you know more clearly what to do, in moments of emergency. But I certainly did never regard myself as a natural leader. I can always remember when I was at high school, we had a school sort of army battalion, and because at that time I was one of the larger boys, I was appointed sergeant of the number 1 platoon. And I was always absolutely petrified that when I was meant to turn the platoon left or turn it right, I was really absolutely hopeless at knowing quite what to do. But fortunately, my platoon, who were really all the misfits in the school, they were the larger misfits, they stood by me, and some of them were pretty good on knowing when to turn left or turn right. So whatever command I gave, they would do the right thing, and we'd all head round, and we were a pretty good platoon as a consequence. And I think maybe in looking back on that, although at the time I felt an absolute idiot, some of the suggestions I made which my platoon ignored and did the right thing, maybe I had a good rapport with them, and as a consequence we were working together pretty much as a team, and we usually did the right thing. But I certainly was completely often at loss as to what was the correct thing to do. But because of the feeling that I had with my platoon, we usually ended up by doing what was right. I really think I probably did my best. I was certainly had strong individualistic attitudes. And I think probably I was at my best when I was given the job as leader of a project. In other words, I was forced to think ahead and make decisions and make sure everything was carried out successfully. I don't think I was ever all that good a follower because I think I did have my own personal ideas, and I really didn't particularly like being ordered around, to tell the truth. So on the other hand, as a leader, I was not the type of leader who orders other people around. I did expect my groups to have good, strong ideas of their own, but for us all to work happily together. And I think on the whole our expeditions as a consequence were very happy ones, and then we had quite strong team spirits. I think the press and the public have created an image of Ed Hillary, hero and explorer, which simply doesn't exist. They've painted a picture of me, as a heroic type, full of enormous courage, tremendous strength, undying enthusiasm and all the rest of it. Well, it's all really just, it's just a story really that's been written up in the newspapers. I'm a person, as I've said, of modest abilities, with a good deal of determination, and I do quite a lot of planning ahead. And with careful planning and good motivation, I think you can often achieve things that other much more talented people would probably do much more easily. But then a lot of these very talented people are not strongly motivated to carry out the things perhaps as I've been involved in. You certainly need planning, you certainly need a degree of skill and fitness, and there's no question at all that you need a little bit of luck. People often say you make your own luck, and I think probably 90% of the luck is self-created. But there is a 10% that you've got to have things right at the right time. if you're heading for the summit, you've got to have a reasonable day for it. And if the weather doesn't treat you right, well, nobody's going to get there. So I guess you'd call that luck. And but if you've planned things, maybe you organise so you can wait for another day and put in your push to the summit. But I do believe that a little bit of luck is quite a useful thing to have. Oh yes, I would say that there have certainly been occasions in which I've been criticised. When we were doing our Antarctic trip and Bunny Fuchs was crossing over the continent and we were putting out loads towards the pole, and we headed off towards the pole, and we actually reached the South Pole several weeks before Fuchs, which was never in the original plans. But we had carried out all the laying of depots which had been in the plans, and I had managed to acquire a dozen extra drums of fuel with the idea that once the task was completed, that we might head off for the pole. There was a little bit of criticism in the media, particularly in Britain, about the fact that we had, as they called, won the race for the pole when we really weren't meant to do it. I don't think I really took that terribly seriously, because never at any stage had it been suggested that we shouldn't go to the pole. It had never been in the plans either. But then I've never been really all that good at sticking to plans, as I mentioned before. So as I went along and as I'd made all the necessary arrangements for a little bit of extra fuel, I decided we would battle on over the last 500 miles and see if we could get to the pole, and we duly did. But I would say in general I've been very fortunate. People on the whole have viewed my activities, I think, in a very kindly fashion. And I really haven't had to put up with much unpleasant criticism. Oh, far too many incidences of constructive criticism. I'm an absolutely impossible person to go along to a talkback show, because people just call in and compliment me on all the things I've been involved in and so on, and I rarely get a good controversial question, which I rather enjoy, good controversial questions. So, but a lot of this is the image that I mentioned has been built up, by the media. I think has created me into sort of a person that really I'm not quite like that at all. I don't like argument, but I enjoy controversial questions, questions that I have to think about and which I may agree or may not agree with. But I like having to put some thought into answering a question. In other words, a question that stretches my mind a little bit, rather than saying, well, thank you very much for saying those kind words. I think that the whole attitude of mountaineers has in many ways been forced to change. Most of the big mountains have been climbed, the summits have been reached, the poles have been reached, people have been down to the depths of the ocean. All the grand things really probably have been largely done. So the really good explorer today gets his challenges by doing things in different ways. He perhaps will climb a mountain by a much more difficult route. He'll do a face climb, which may be steeper and more dangerous. And he's got the technical equipment and the technique to be able to carry out these things very effectively. Things that we simply didn't have 40 years ago. So I think a lot of the big challenges nowadays, unless you're going out into space or something like that, I suppose, are doing things in a more difficult way, by a more difficult route, and in a different fashion. So the modern explorer, with his greater technical ability and better equipment, is able to do harder challenges, and as a consequence he gets the same satisfaction out of that as we did 40 years ago, with really in many ways less effective equipment, but doing in many ways more modest achievements. So I think it's all relative. It's not really what you've done that's important, but it's the sort of challenge it has been for you with your degree of ability and equipment and what you're trying to overcome. If I'm selecting a group, I like the first thing I think one has to look for is a record of achievement. It may be modest achievement, but people have shown that they can persist, they can carry out objectives and get to a final solution. If they can do that on small things, then there's a very good chance that they'll perform well on big things at the same time. And then I'm a great believer in a really good sense of humour. You know, if you have someone in an expedition who's reasonably competent and has a great sense of humour, they're a very stimulating factor for the whole team, and they play a very important psychological part, I think, in the success of the team. I personally, if I could possibly help it, wouldn't be on a serious pursuit in which there weren't a few people who could laugh a bit about it. Because I can remember many occasions, maybe we've been stuck in a tent way up on the side of a mountain, there's heavy snow, avalanches all around us, and we can't get up and we can't get down. But we just sat in the tent and reminisced about occasions and days gone by and laughed about old jokes and all the rest of it. And you really have a very good time, even though you're sort of poised there, as it were between disaster, both up and down. And people who can make you laugh under those circumstances are very valuable indeed in an expedition. Well, I would have said in the first 33 years of my life, which is up until I climbed Everest, I was a very restless and to some degree perhaps a slightly unhappy sort of person. And I really didn't have a great deal of social life, but I'd become very interested in adventurous activities. Perhaps I was, in some respects, something of a loner, as it were. But after Everest, I got married, and that certainly changed my life very considerably indeed. And I found it was possible to mix having a family with continuing on with adventurous activities. But I really think a great deal of that was having a suitable wife. My wife was very long-suffering. She knew that there were certain things I wanted to do, and she was happy that I should do them. She was prepared to put up with considerable periods of being alone with the kids, and she was marvelous. So it made it possible for me to do the things that I wanted to do as well. And when I was home, we had a very relaxed and pleasant family life. So I really feel that that over those years, from 1953 to 1975, were extremely happy years for me. I did many adventurous activities. I got deeply involved in these aid programs for the people of the Himalayas. I had a nice family. We took our families into the out of doors. We camped and we swam and we clambered around the hills. And for me it was a very full and a very happy existence. Well, then of course came the disaster in 1975 when my wife and my youngest daughter were flying into the Nepal hills where I was building a hospital, and their plane crashed and they were killed. And this certainly for me was an absolute disaster really, because the two people who meant most to me really in life had been killed in one fell swoop. And it did take me quite a number of years to get over it. I found the only way actually to deal with it was to carry on very energetically doing the things that we had all been doing together, which was largely building schools and things for the mountain people. And although people used to say to me, well, time is the great healer and all this sort of thing, certainly for the first few years, I simply didn't accept this. But time was a great healer. And after, the years passed, the memories certainly still remain. But I think quite a lot of the pain tends to fade a little bit. And as time passed, life did become a little bit easier. And then, of course, some years later, my wife and I had been very close friends with another couple. Peter had gone with me to the South Pole and been with me in the Himalayas, and his wife June and my wife Louise were very close friends and had been for years and years. Well, Peter died in a plane crash, and this was a plane crash in the Antarctic. And so ultimately June and I, who had been close friends for years and years, decided, well, it wouldn't be a bad idea if we were both alone, so we got married. And so over the last 6 or 7 years, that has been a very happy arrangement, and in a sense, a new stage in my life has developed. I firmly believe that companionship, and good companionship, is one of the most valuable things that you can have, and we've certainly had that over the last 7 or 8 years. Well, I was extremely restless, and being restless, I think, can be a slightly unhappy sort of existence, even though it often stimulated me into, getting involved in energetic activities. But I don't think I really was a particularly, certainly was never a happy teenager. I think being a teenager is the worst period in anybody's life, having observed myself and even my children. It's an important period in anybody's life, but so many teenagers are so uncertain and so miserable, sort of trying to feel their way and all the rest of it. There are some teenagers, however, that thoroughly enjoy it, I must admit, but I have no desire whatsoever, if I was given the opportunity to go back to being a teenager, heavens alive, I would dodge it like fury. Well, I do think that friends are valuable, very valuable to have, and particularly good older friends. If you're even a beginner, perhaps, in your teens, in some sort of interesting and adventurous activity, quite often you simply don't want to think about or be involved with older people, and you just want to do your own thing and be with younger people. But I recommend to young people that it's foolish to really start from scratch again. Older people really have a lot of experience, they have a lot of knowledge. Some of them are even quite pleasant people. And I recommend to the young ones to take advantage of all that previous experience and knowledge and understanding which older people have, absorb it all, and then drop the old people, if you like, and go off and do your own thing. At least you're starting with all that built-up accumulation of knowledge and understanding that's been going on for generations. I think this is a very valuable thing that young people can do. And quite often a young person who is unhappy and uncertain can make friendships with some slightly older people with more experience, and maybe learn a little bit from them, and get a little bit more certain in themselves. Now, I know a lot of youngsters couldn't care less about this, but that's what I would recommend to a lot of them. I actually learnt a lot from older people when I was in my 20s. What little I did learn was mostly from older people, not from young ones. I had a grandmother who was an Irish grandmother actually, who came out to New Zealand, and she was a wonderful old lady actually. She lived up to 96 years old, and even in her 90s she had great vitality and great enthusiasm and tremendous sense of fun. And I know that for a while I was quite influenced by her spirit, as she seemed to she showed, during the latter days of her life. But I really have no idea why I wanted to keep dashing on in these ways, because I realized that it wasn't the normal attitude of the majority of young people. Most young people were, more interested in going to the movies or going to the beach or something or other. I really wasn't all that great on that sort of stuff. I just wanted to get out in the hills. I know I did pass through a phase when books like King Solomon's Mines, King Solomon's Mines? Oh, Rider Haggard was the actual author, and he wrote these great sort of romantic adventure stories. And then I used to enjoy Georgette Heyer, in which the hero was usually a rather sort of middle-aged gentleman who a very good sword fighter, and a beautiful young lady, and all the rest of it. And there was great sword fighting, and it was all highly romantic, adventurous sort of activity. But I used to find these things quite entertaining. I even passed through a phase in which I quite enjoyed Western stories. Nowadays I find them a little bit on the naive side, to tell you the honest truth, but certainly for a period, the Western stories I found quite entertaining, light reading, because they are very romanticized, as we all know. But later on, I became much more interested in reading autobiographies or biographies, particularly about people who had made their mark in some fashion in the community. And I still do very much enjoy reading books of that nature. I read so many sort of mountaineering books, for instance, that it's rather put me off reading mountaineering books now. But I read dozens and dozens of books by people like Shipton and Smythe and the Antarctic explorers and all those sort of things. One of the great experiences I had in the Antarctic was there was a what was the name of the book? It was called The Worst Journey in the World, and it was largely about a trip taken on Scott's expedition when they travelled across an area called the Windless Bight, which was very cold temperatures and deep soft snow, and they went out to Cape Crozier during the winter darkness, to examine the emperor penguin colony there. And it was a fantastic story. Well, when I went down to the Antarctic, I had rather simple farm tractors. But we redid this journey, but we didn't do it during the complete darkness. We did it just as darkness was approaching. And we did it in our old tractors, and we struggled across the windless bights, and we had very cold temperatures. And we were looking for the actual camp that these men had established during the darkness. Most astonishing feat, really. And we clambered in our vehicles up on the side of the Cape Crozier Peninsula, and then we searched around for this old camp. which had been established many, many years before. And we were unsuccessful. And I remember returning back into our tents, and I was with Peter Mulgrew, who was with me. And I got out the book, Worst Journey in the World, and I read through again carefully the pages about when they established their camp. And then I decided that we'd been looking in the wrong direction. And Peter also decided we'd been looking in the wrong direction. But we disagreed as to which direction it was. So we put all our warm gear on again and we crawled out of the tent. I headed off in one direction and Peter headed off in the other, and it was almost darkness now. Well, I happened to be going in the right direction and stumbled down on a low ridge going out across the great ice shelf. And I suddenly ahead of me saw a rock wall, obviously made by human beings. And inside the rock wall there were all sorts of bits and pieces of scientific equipment that they'd left behind. Matter of fact, there were hundreds, literally hundreds of test tubes that had been left there, and pieces of clothing and old skis and things of that nature. And that really was one of the most exciting moments that I can remember. I called out to everybody over in the camp, and we all came over, and to look on this thoroughly miserable campsite, terrible campsite, where these people had spent several weeks in complete darkness carrying out their scientific research. It really was an amazing experience. So in that sense, I relived, although to a lesser degree, what these heroic figures in that book, The Worst Journey in the World, had described so well. My autobiography was just really a narrative of as well as I could produce it of what had happened to me and what I had thought and what I had carried out. I think it's probably the best book I have produced, although I don't necessarily say that makes it one of the great books of all time. I would like to think anyway that from my worst journey in the world, it would indicate to people that you don't have to be a genius or an exceptional person to take part in interesting activities and to ultimately be successful in them. Most of the exceptional people I know are people who have had the mental ability and the physical ability to perform to a high degree of excellence, and I certainly was never in that sort of class. I think as far as determination and motivation was concerned, I was reasonably competent, but I was certainly not a great athlete. I would advise them to aim high, to set their sights at a pretty tough target, and don't be too worried if you don't win and be successful at first. Just keep persisting and keep improving your standards, getting better and better, and that ultimately you've got a pretty fair chance at achieving your desired goal. I'm not one of those people who believe, for instance, that every American could, if they so wish, become President of the United States. I mean, there's a limited number of presidents of the United States, and obviously only a few are going to achieve that. But I do think that virtually everybody that's born has the ability to be very competent at doing something. And I think that in itself is worthy of aiming towards. Just to be competent at doing anything you particularly wish to do. But to tell you the honest truth, I don't normally preach to young people anyway, not unless they ask me a question. Even with my kids, I never try to tell them what they ought to do. I think my wife and I tried to build up in them a love of the out of doors, and they enjoyed camping and swimming and canoeing and those type of activities. But as far as actually trying to tell them how they should organise their lives and what philosophies they should have, I prefer really to leave that to them to discover for themselves. I think it's very hard indeed to impart to a young person what you think they should do. I think most of our major challenges are not going to be in the physical field at all. I think they're going to be in the field of human relations, of getting on with each other, of contributing, people accepting that they have to contribute something, their thoughts, their ideas, maybe even their money, towards producing a world society that is perhaps a little bit more honest and reasonable than it is now. I think about jobs still to be done, and I sometimes wish I knew some of the answers to the problems which seem to plague humanity. And I think a lot about people and about our environment. But there are so many things that are difficult to understand and to overcome, that finding answers for them is not always easy at all. But I suppose if everything was easy, then life would be exceptionally boring. As I've got older, my goals perhaps have become a little bit more solidified, perhaps, in that my main concentrations are on the welfare of the people I've worked with in the Himalayas, and I think on human welfare in general. And also, I'm definitely extremely interested in our world and the environment, and talking about these matters and trying to encourage people to be more concerned about what we're doing to our world. Now, I am just one of thousands and thousands of people, of course, who have these same views these days. And I think this is one of the great steps forward we've seen in modern decades, the considerable growing interest that people have in the world, in the environment, and in keeping it reasonably clean and wholesome. And I certainly hope it remains that way. I mean, there's so many young people today who haven't got that view, who see constant challenges in every direction and are doing exciting and adventurous things. The main thing about challenges is that they don't just always just pop into your lap, as it were. You have to have your eyes open, you have to be alert. And otherwise a challenge may well pass you by and you won't see it at all. So I think if you are ready for challenges, if you're physically fit and you feel you're well trained and your interests have been turned in the right direction and your eyes are open, you'll see challenges. There are challenges all over the place. Well, I guess I mean that, our heroes in space are remarkably competent and well-trained people. But I don't think they are encouraged to be individualistic. I mean, they are extremely competent in set routines, and they have great ability to carry out these highly technical things, and they display great courage and determination in the process. But they are highly trained technicians almost in their particular field. I just think that maybe there's some place in the future for perhaps people who are pretty good at improvising. I think I'm quite good at improvising, actually. And I think there are a lot of people around who are not extremely good technicians, but are quite good at improvising. I think many businessmen, for instance, may not have extremely good university degrees on business administration, but they're exceptionally good at improvising and at carrying things through to a successful conclusion. And I think in all aspects of life, the improviser, the person with imagination, and perhaps not quite so much technical skill, there is still a place for them. I always think that the bush pilots up in the far north, of course, are very, very competent with their aircraft, but they have great ability to improvise, to land in all sorts of strange places, and to do rather daring things very successfully. That's really the sort of thing I was referring to. People who are pretty competent, but not utterly expert, but with the ability to adapt to all sorts of conditions.